Time dictates so many aspects of our lives, maybe every aspect. The tick-tock of clocks is a constant soundtrack to our days, and even days are a measure of time. Time itself is a complex beast. It seems instinctively simple. After all, it's always there. But its true nature and why it behaves in a certain way, that remains a mystery. Our relationship with it has also massively changed in modern times. I'm your host, Dr. Alfredo Carpineti from IFL Science, and to understand what is time and how do we measure it, we spoke to an expert, Dr. Emily Akkermans, Curator of Time at the Royal Observatory Greenwich, which is celebrating its 350th anniversary. Welcome to the Big Questions. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
It's our absolute pleasure. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and what you do?
Yes, so I am Curator of Time at the Royal Observatory, which in a nutshell means I look after our fascinating collection of horological or timekeeping objects. We have about 1,000 objects in my collection, and they range from marine chronometers, lots of pocket chronometers, and we have, of course, not all, but a few of the timekeepers that were actually used at the Royal Observatory itself. We also have some nice domestic timekeeping objects, so a nice variety representing clockmaking in all its varieties. So it's a perfect job for me because I studied clockmaking, focusing on the restoration of antique clocks. And I also studied metals conservation to get more into the conservation aspect of museum work. And whilst I was doing an internship at Royal Museums Greenwich, so we're not just the Royal Observatory, we're also the Maritime Museum. We also have a collection centre, a Queen's House and the Cutty Sark. So I was part of the conservation team when I got the opportunity to do a PhD with the museum looking at our marine chronometer collection. So with all that background, this is just a great job for me.
That sounds like a great job, and let me tell you, Curator of Time sounds like the most amazing title ever.
It's a good excuse for being late, because who's going to argue?
Exactly, you're in charge of time. That's amazing. Thank you very much for joining us. I think our first question should be a little bit of background and on how we got to the modern timekeepers. So can you paint us a picture of how we measure time before clocks?
Yes, so that would be a very itty-bitty picture because we have, of course, many cultures around the world existing for thousands of years, and there were so many different ways that people would have kept track of time, and for so many different reasons. We also just don't have much evidence of practices, so we can only infer them sometimes from texts or from the remains of things. So it's a vast history, and I have to say that's probably one of the great things about time is that it's such a vast subject. It's incomprehensible, as you mentioned before. We don't even really know what it is, and so there are so many aspects of it that you can study, and one of them is like time before clocks. It's not one that I know in depth. It's just too big. But what I do know is that it was mainly tracking astronomy, so looking at the stars, the sun. For various reasons, you need to know when to harvest, when to sow. You need to know when monsoon season might be coming. You need to know when to travel. So if you have light and dark, or if you're a nomadic system, you might use the moon more, you might use the sun more. So it's very varied depending on where you are and what your purpose is. So some of the earliest devices that people will be familiar with are sundials. So using a sundial to track the passage of time by the sun only works during the day, of course, and will not work when it's overcast. So it can be a bit limited. Other cultures used water clocks, so they could be used at night. They would rely on the fall of water to regulate some means of time. So in Indian and Chinese cultures, there used to be incense clocks where you would burn a stick. So you're basically measuring periods of times, intervals. And for different cultures, there are different reasons for doing this. So for the Egyptians, they were tracking time mainly for religious reasons. The Babylonians were very interested in astronomy, so they were keeping track of time for astronomical purposes. But yeah, so I think you're getting an idea of just how weirdly wild and wonderful this history of timekeeping is.
It's so interesting, like for us, time, as I said, is everything, is always there. But just a few hundred years ago, and for millennia before, the practices were so wild. Imagine that, just like, oh yeah, we'll meet up at some point. Come to the forum when if the sundial is working. Otherwise, I'll be there. So, but something must have changed in the 1700s, and we needed clocks, and that's where your area of expertise come in. So, can you tell us why there was a need for clocks in the 1700s?
Yeah, so this is driven by astronomy. And so in the 1700s, or 1675 for the Royal Observatory was when it was founded. And clocks had been around for a couple of hundreds of years, so for centuries. Mechanical timepieces, often found, in public, in huge, turret clocks in monastic life to regulate the life of the monks living there. And so it's basically, there is a mechanical clock which divides the day into hours and minutes. Not very accurately, but, enough. Not everyone needs very accurate time. You just need to know when to meet or when something ends. Whether it's exactly at that o'clock or that o'clock might be less of an issue depending on who you are. So it's astronomy that really drives this need for more accurate time, so that precise measurement. And this is because they want to understand the movement of the planets, the movement of the stars, and that can be measured through time. So if you look at the rotation of the Earth means that we can see the stars and the sun move across the heavens. And to really understand their place, or to create a map of them, you need time to measure where they are in relation to each other. So for astronomical purposes, time was very important. And it's Christian Huygens, well, we can go back further to Galileo, who's looking into ways of finding a more regular timepiece, a more accurate timepiece, with his theory of a pendulum clock, of a swinging regular oscillator that you can use to measure a regular frequency. But it's Christian Huygens, a Dutch mathematician and astronomer, who actually puts this into a practical working clock as we know it in 1656-57. So, as I said, he's an astronomer and a mathematician, and he's also very keen. So at this point in Europe, astronomy is very much tied up in finding longitude at sea, so determining longitude on land and at sea. And Christian Huygens is trying to make a portable clock that will help him determine his place at sea when you have basically nothing around you to tell you where you are. So it's important to understand that at that time, there was this drive by European powers to find what they call find the longitude. So finding out where you are at sea when you don't have GPS and an iPhone to tell you exactly where you are. That's if you're getting a signal, which I often don't.
Yeah, okay, but with a pendulum clock, I can see that there might be a problem putting it on a boat, given that not only you need to keep the pendulum moving regularly, the boat is moving and oscillating through the wave and everything. So what's the challenge there? How do you solve that? And maybe what has the Royal Observatory, what kind of role the Royal Observatory played into that?
Yes, so that is exactly the major problem, and it took another 100 years to overcome. So the problem was twofold, really, and it's easy to sort of separate it into two elements, an astronomical element and a timekeeping element, even though they are intertwined and you can't really separate them. But yeah, so what Christian Huygens was doing was he was attempting this pendulum clock that had improved the accuracy of its measurements because of its regular swing, which was regulated by gravity. He was trying to make that work on, like you say, the rocking ship going across the ocean where the temperature variations are huge, which also affects timekeeping. And he spent the rest of his life trying to achieve this. And had some success at some sea trials, but ultimately never achieved what he desired. And at the same time, the Royal Observatory is founded because there's another way of finding your time at sea, which is not using a mechanical clock, but it's kind of using the celestial sky as a clock. And the easiest way, I guess, to explain it or to understand it is you have to envision the fixed stars, so the stars that you see as the background, as the kind of clock dial, and to imagine that the moon moving quite quickly through the sky is your clock hand. And astronomers had known for a couple of centuries that you could use this to determine the time somewhere else and determine the time and know the time somewhere else in a different location. It's a very, very complicated method, by the way. Very, very complicated. And again, it takes centuries to get it working. But that was what the Royal Observatory was founded to do. It was basically founded, so John Flamsteed moves in 1675. He has the most accurate pendulum clocks of the day, and his job is to create a map of all the stars so that they can create that dial, that background that they need. So they already had star maps, as I'll call them, but because of the inaccuracies in their timekeeping devices, they weren't very accurate maps. So that's Flamsteed's first task, is to do that. And that's basically to help what this lunar method, it's called the lunar distance method. And the idea is that Flamsteed can provide the astronomical data that's needed to work out the lunar distance method for use at sea. Again, this takes another 100 years almost to put into practice. It's complicated. Newton was working on it, Isaac Newton. He's working on his theory of the moon. John Flamsteed, the first astronomer royal, and Isaac Newton fall out about this, and there's a lot of fun stories there.
Newton is known to have drama with other scientists, so... Okay, so we had this crucial beginning of clocks and timekeeping and how it started helping with navigation. What happened after? How does it move from this first accurate pendulum clocks from Flamsteed work? What is the next step?
It's a slow one.
Okay.
At the Royal Observatory, they have a lot of teething problems with the clocks. They stop, they slow down, they're not in great paces, the weather gets to them, the dirt gets in them, they stop again, they're not running very well, the clockmaker won't give them the key, there's a lot going on, but eventually, they get them up and running and they can start using them for their astronomical observations. They update their clocks, so the initial clocks that John Flamsteed used, they weren't temperature regulated, so to be accurate, because clocks are made of metals expand and contract when the temperature rises or falls. This affects timekeeping. So there were gradual advancements in the clock technologies so that the pendulum, there were pendulum temperature compensations, which makes them more accurate. So gradually at the Royal Observatory, with better instruments, newer telescopes, the astronomers are collecting all the celestial data slowly, but it's not being used at sea. So, 50 years after the founding of the observatory, sailing is carrying on as it always did, with absolutely no help from the Royal Observatory or the astronomers there. This comes still later on. Meanwhile, we have John Harrison, a clockmaker, who is born in Yorkshire, late 17th century, moves to Barrow upon Humber, so in Lincolnshire. And he's, we don't know too much about his early life. He's a self-educated man. He's self-taught clockmaker, we always say. He had a great interest in mechanics, and he starts making accurate clocks with his younger brother, James, who's often left out. So I like James. I want to know more about James as well. But yes, so with it, the two brothers work together. They make wooden clocks, very precise clocks. And they start to, they in their designs, so because they're not working in London, where it's quite, determined, you follow your apprenticeship, you learn the clockmaking traditions, and you're kind of bound by the rules, I suppose. They're working a little bit differently. So they're testing new things. And John Harrison has a background in carpentry. His father was a joiner. Mm-hmm. So he's using wooden materials in his clocks. And he has a good knowledge of woods. So he uses lignum vitae, a tropical hardwood that has self-oiling properties. So what I'm getting at is, going out to sea, you have a couple of problems facing a portable timepiece, you have the fact that the pendulum clock will not work on board a rocking ship. It will just stop. Another problem is that clocks inherently have a lot of friction, all the materials moving alongside each other. So they need oil to reduce the friction, but the oils of the day were all natural and they were bad quality for what they were doing. So they would turn acidic, dirt would collect in the oil, and the clock would cease to run accurately quite quickly. So it would need to be stripped down, cleaned, put together, re-oiled, set going again, which is of no use to you if you're at sea and you're meant to have your clock tracking your time for you. So that was a big problem. And the third problem was the temperature. As I said, the contracting and expanding of metals. So there were those, in a nutshell, those three problems needed to be overcome to get a clock to work at sea. And this is what John Harris is working on. And with his brother, he's already kind of found a solution to two of these problems by using the lignum vitae and brass and using rolling instead of sliding bearings. He's eliminated the need for oil. So he was already making clocks without oil. So minimized friction completely, no need for oil. So that's one problem, basically. I'm very simplifying this, but it's done with. He creates this wonderful system called the gridiron system, which is, so if your pendulum rod expands, lengthens, time slows down. If it shortens, time speeds up. So if you're working somewhere with a pendulum clock and you want the meeting to be over, just shorten that pendulum and it will be over quicker. If you're enjoying yourself, you lengthen that pendulum as long as you can and your hour will go by far more slowly. So what Harrison did was shows his knowledge of materials. He used steel and brass rods put together in such a way that when the temperature rises and the metals expand, they do so in such a way that the length of the pendulum does not vary. The metals move, but the length remains the same. Again, that will compensate for any variations in temperature, which is a huge effect on timekeeping accuracy. And accuracy really is the aim for timekeeping at sea, for knowing your place, for navigating. So Harrison, with those two elements already in his pocket, so to say, Harrison comes to the Royal Observatory, and he comes to the Royal Observatory because he thinks he can make a clock that works at sea, and he's heard about the 1714 Act of Longitude. So, as I said before, the observatory was founded in 1675. By 1714, nothing, no help. So, by an act of Queen Anne, Act of Longitude, a reward is offered for anyone who could find a method for keeping longitude at sea. The reward is £20,000. No idea what that is in today's money. There are wildly different accuracies, but it would be millions. It's significant.
Yeah, it would be a lot.
Yeah, I'd like it, but
yeah.
But so that's kind of what drives John Harrison, and he actually visits the Royal Observatory. This is in the 1720s, so John Flamsteed has passed away. His successor, Edmund Halley, is now Astronomer Royal, and he visits the observatory. He speaks to Edmund Halley. Halley recommends that he goes and sees London's leading clockmaker, George Graham, and talk about his ideas. There's Harrison writes about the first encounter saying, "We get off to a frosty start, but got the ice broke and I stayed for dinner." So they hit it off. Graham lends Harrison money to go back, which is quite a significant thing. I think he lends him about £250 to go back up to Lincoln and work on his first sea clock as we now know it. We call it H1, Harrison 1. So this is kind of the development of portable clockmaking in the 18th century, driven for about 25 years, 30 years by John Harrison, working on what becomes known as a series of clocks named H1, H2, H3, and finally H4. And it's basically his drive to create a portable, accurate timekeeper at sea. So the astronomers have accurate timekeepers on land. Some of them have mercury in them for their temperature compensation. And later on, his gridiron concept is also, but they are fixed. They're fixed to a wall. You know, they have tiny oscillations, they're pendulums to make them more accurate. So they do not work at sea. But those are kind of the two developments in accuracy that are going on at the same time.
And does Harrison manage to build an accurate clock at sea? Does H4 work?
It does, but it's complicated.
Fair enough.
Isn't it always? So what he does is I call them H1 to H3, I call the pendulum prototypes. That's his attempt to bring a pendulum clock and make it accurate at sea. In each design, he changes stuff. There are new inventions. H3 has some really fascinating ones. He creates the bimetallic strip. I made myself a cup of tea this morning. A similar principle is in kettles everywhere today. But it's basically two metals fused together so that when one of them expands at a different rate than the other, they move in such a way that they can compensate within the clockwork, the temperature changes. So brilliant invention. He also puts together the first practical application of a caged roller bearing, now known as the ball bearing you see in lots of different industrial. So it's a really fascinating timepiece, but it never even goes to sea. Of all his prototypes, H1 has a trial going to Lisbon and back and does very well. H2 never goes to sea. H3 never goes to sea. H4 does. So with H4, Harrison takes a radically different approach. Rather than try and get a pendulum clock to work at sea, he goes to watchmaking, because watches have been around. They're portable, but they're incredibly inaccurate. So they were never even considered like that they would achieve the accuracy needed for sea. But Harrison again achieves this, and he does this by just changing some of the fundamental principles of the oscillating element, the balance wheel. He makes it big, he makes it swing a lot faster. And H4 goes to sea, and it goes to the West Indies and back, and it does very well. In the meantime, we are quite a long time after the Act of Longitude, and they're becoming a bit more strict with just handing out rewards. Harrison keeps getting money from the board to work on his ideas, so he's had a couple of £1,000, I believe, by then. And the problem with Harrison's timekeepers is that he's very secretive, not showing, he doesn't want to share. He's worried that someone else will, get that reward before him. And also, it costs quite a lot of money to make. And what they need is a method that all ships can use, not just that one ship that's carrying H4. So that's where there's a very long story to this behind Harrison and the Board of Longitude and this issue of the reward, and did he deserve it? And people are still heavily debating it today. But yes, so in a nutshell, he shows it's possible, and he gets his rewards, some of it from Parliament, some of it from the board. And copies are made of his watch. They were made by Larkram Kendall, a watchmaker. They're called K1, K2, and K3. All have fascinating histories. But ultimately, what became the marine chronometer, what became the precision tool used for navigating at sea, differs quite a lot from the design Harrison made. So other watchmakers and clockmakers step in. They come up with their own technological advancements, and the marine chronometer kind of comes to life in the late 18th century and gradually starts to be used, mainly first by the East India Company and later by the Royal Navy. And the Royal Observatory is central in testing these instruments, and that's why we have to come back to astronomy, because you always need astronomy to regulate your timekeepers. So before sailors are using chronometers to navigate at sea, they are using a technique called dead reckoning, which is you keep an estimation of your direction, your speeds, you have knowledge of the currents and the winds. So you're plotting your track constantly to know where you are. Chronometers are a more sophisticated form of dead reckoning. They're keeping track of the time for you so you know where you are. But similar to dead reckoning, if a chronometer stops, you can't start it again and determine your longitude. It's gone. You've lost your time. You've lost your longitude, because the only way to really get it is through astronomy, which is where the lunar distance methods comes back in. So around the same time that John Harrison has developed H4 and it's being tested, Neville Maskelyne, the fifth Astronomer Royal, has finally put together all the work of Flamsteed, Halley, all the other astronomers, Newton's theory of the moon, and he has produced a guide that can be used at sea to do the lunar distance method, which, as I said, is vastly complicated. And other instruments were developed. The sextant is developed in the meantime as well, which is crucial for making the celestial observations. For my PhD research, I went through the books and the calculations. It's mind-boggling. It's they did it. Trying to reverse engineer what they were doing is hugely interesting, but it does show you how complicated it is. So yeah, basically by 100 years after the founding of the Royal Observatory, we finally have a lunar distance method that can be used at sea and a chronometer that can be used to support it. They're often seen as competing methods. I think we often hear the story that the lunar distance method competed against the chronometer method. The chronometer method won and poor dead reckoning was no more, which is not the case. Dead reckoning still underpinned navigation. You needed it. It was fundamental for navigation. And the chronometers and the lunar distances both came in and just gave a new range of tools that could be used. And they were used in different ways by different people who had different aims. So it's a fascinating history.
Yeah, absolutely. And clearly there were some very specific needs for this, the marine chronometer, for all the astronomy that was being done at the Royal Observatory. But the impact has spread way beyond, and it ended up changing science. Let's jump ahead. Why then, with these improvements, we got to a point in which we had to have a coordinated universal time, having our time zone, etc.?
Okay, that is another deep dive into the history of timekeeping, a very fascinating one. So I guess it's back also to how people measure time before clocks, because the sun is, of course, our most important timekeeper. It tells us, it sets our circadian rhythm. Well, I like to be up early. I like the morning sun. Not everyone would agree with that, but yeah, we do. We tend to sleep at night and be up and about in the day. I mean, whether you get up at the crack of dawn or more towards noon, it's still, the sun is important. So the sun regulates our lives. However, before we had a standardized time, so before everyone used the same time, everyone used different time. And it's as simple as, I'll use the UK as an example because that's easy for me, so I work at Greenwich, the sun rises, hits noon, middle of the day, and sets at certain times. But if I travel further to the east, because the sun rises in the east, the sunrise, noon, and sunset occurs slightly earlier in the day for people further to the east, and later in the day for people further to the west. So between Greenwich and Bristol, it's about 10 minutes. So if you're using the sun as your timekeeper, which people were, that means if you're on the same longitude, the same north-south line, you've got the same time. Further east, you're running at a slightly earlier time. West, you're running at a slightly later time. Fine. Like, nobody cares. It doesn't matter. You're not traveling by high-speed rail. So the differences don't matter. You're traveling on foot, by horse, and it's all fine. It doesn't matter until the post offices start using a standard time, but it's really the railways that usher in a standard time across Britain, because suddenly travel is speeding up. People are going from one city to another, but you're going from Bristol to London. You're leaving in Bristol time and you're arriving in London time, which is a 10-minute difference. So the railways need to choose which time they're going to use on their line. So trains, for example, running from Liverpool to London might use Liverpool time on the way down, but London time on the way back, or vice versa. So basically the railways are coming up against this annoyance of time. So they select a standard time and call it railway time, London time, or even Greenwich time, because ultimately it's from the Royal Observatory that they get accurate time. But that's the first standardization of time, is a railway running to, I'll call it Greenwich time from now on, Greenwich time because they got the accurate time from the observatory, thanks to the astronomers and all their work over the centuries. And this is in the 1840s. However, you have the railways running maybe to Greenwich time, but the local towns themselves are still using their local time. So now you have a difference between the railway time and the time of the city. So gradually, the cities themselves start to use Greenwich time. Not all of them are keen to do so. There is a period where you might have two. There are some clocks, the Bristol Corn Exchange is a good example, that have 2-minute hands, so you can show both times. You can show the Bristol local time and the Greenwich time that the railways were using. But yeah, this is your first step towards standardization. And it's not clear cut. It's not that they decide, oh, it's now that time, and then everyone suddenly has it. It's more gradual. Mistakes are made. Signals aren't sent out. People use their own local time anyway, because they're not going to use that time. So it's a very gradual process, but it does happen. And in 1880, because now so many people are using Greenwich time, others are using local time, there can be confusion, because in some cases it means that what happens for one person happens on a Wednesday late, just before midnight, but using another time it might be Thursday morning, which is a problem in legal cases. So in 1880, GMT, Greenwich Mean Time, is made legal time for Britain. So that's kind of the first standardization of time within a country. So the next thing is the global standardization of time, which is another 100 years of process. So for the UK, one time zone is enough. We're not that big a country. But for somewhere like Russia, the United States, China, these are huge countries, East and West. They have there's a far greater difference between the East and the West country of time. And it's in the United States that the idea of time zones kind of gets ushered in. So when you think about longitude, you have the Earth, 360 degrees of the Earth, and it rotates once every 24 hours. So that means each 180 degrees is 12-hour difference. Each 15 degrees is a 1-hour difference. In theory, time zones are you split the world into segments of 15 degrees, and each segment keeps a time which is an hour different to the next. The idea is that it's a lot easier to change between time than if you're working in minutes, seconds. So, for example, Greenwich Mean Time, Paris Mean Time, difference between the two is 9 minutes, 21 seconds or something like that. That's quite difficult to adjust to. It's more easy if you can just adjust just the hour hands, 1 hour difference. Mm-hmm. And that's what they do in the United States for the railways. I mean, one person had the idea that everyone keeps the same time, that there's just one time across the world, so no time zones. Everyone is on UTC 0. But that means for some people, it's so embedded with us that noon is when the sun is high in the sky, it's 12 o'clock. But for some people, that would be 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And it's a step too far, I think, for most. So we have the time zone system of an hour difference. So to keep that relationship with the sun and the clock that's so embedded with us. So gradually you get time zones within a country. The United States choose, because Washington is almost 75 degrees from Greenwich. So that's 75 divided by 15 is, not doing this out of my head, that's 5 hours time difference.
5, yes.
Yes, you're very good. So that's a 5-hour difference. And they choose to base their time zone system on Greenwich Mean Time and implement that. And then eventually there's a growing call to standardize time, or using time systems, just because of the increasing global trade and travel and navigation and commerce. And so eventually we settle on a globalized time, just because time is now so embedded in the world around us, far more than it was before. And it's just a very gradual process. And even the system we came up with 30 years ago is now running up against problems, because everything has moved on so quickly.
So by the time that the world has agreed on having universal time, timekeeping has changed massively from those first clocks and watches, even the most accurate one. How has the precision changed since the beginning? It's
changed a lot. And it's a very interesting development, because what I like about the change is what it allows us to do. If you look at Flamsteed's first clocks that were installed when the Royal Observatory was built, called the Great Clocks, they were accurate to, I think some people say, about 7 seconds a day. What this means is a bit weird, because they sometimes would have just stopped. So it's an average, maybe, I don't know. But, they had an accuracy. With that accuracy, Flamsteed was able to do some things. He was able to make his star maps, but he was also, in one of his first jobs that he did, he used these clocks to prove, this was a theory at the time, and it underpinned all the theories about navigation and timekeeping. The idea was that the Earth rotated at a constant speed. And with these great clocks, that's the first thing he proved, that this theory was correct. So building on that, they were able to do the lunar distance method, and all their astronomical data was all compiled on this fact. And this is down to what level of accuracy his clocks could achieve. Pendulum clocks were fascinating. They did many things. And so I think to understand a bit where the discipline is taking us, it's good to understand what the pendulum clocks were also used for, because we know them, they tell us the time, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. But they're a measuring tool. So in the 19th century, pendulums were also used to determine what they called the figure of the Earth. So the Earth is not a perfect sphere, it's a blade. And we know this because the gravity varies. And with that, you can determine things. So because a pendulum in London, to have it swing at a second, it needs to be a certain length. And the length at which a pendulum will oscillate at 1 second is dependent on gravity. So if gravity decreases or increases, so does the length of your pendulum. So they used pendulums, and they went on Royal Navy voyages called pendulum experiments. They went out into the Atlantic Ocean to measure the difference in gravity across the globe. They take them up to the Arctic, and they measure the differences in gravity so that they can determine what the figure of the Earth is. But they also do experiments up the top of mountains and down in the depths of mines, because they want to figure out what the density of the Earth is. And knowing the density of the Earth, they want to find out the density of the sun and other planets. So it's all into this kind of like endeavour to understand and measure our solar system, or at least some of the aspects of our solar system. So pendulums are used for that, and they can do that because of this accuracy they're gaining. So we're rotating at a constant speeds. That is until we come to the most accurate pendulum clocks, which were developed in the 1920s, and the introduction of quartz as a timekeeper. So a pendulum swings 1 second. A quartz crystal vibrates at a much higher frequency than a pendulum. So you can start to measure more accurately. And it's from the 1920s, 40s that the observatory starts using these new technologies. And this is, again, a theory that's been around, that there is actually some variation in the Earth's rotation, but now they can actually detect, measure it, and quantify it. And they measure the Earth's rotation, and it is not constant. It varies. And even more important, it varies in unpredictable ways. And this leads to a huge thing, I guess, in time, is that the definition of time changes, as in the measurement of time. So the definition of the second previously was 1 part of an average solar day, but which was constant until we had better measuring tools. So when we measure that it's not constant, you have a unit that's not constant. So there's a need to step away from that. Not long after the quartz and the short technology, this is such a quick development compared to like the long reign of the pendulum, that atomic clocks come in, and they have now an accuracy. I think the first ones were 1 second in 3 million years. So they would only, after 3 million years, would they lose a second. This is compared with Flamsteed 3 seconds a day, which is huge. So we have atomic clocks, and the second is redefined. So the Earth ceases to be our reference as a timekeeper. It is now an atom. It's mind-boggling.
It is.
We've gone from the universe as a celestial timekeeper to a tiny atom. But we do respect our celestial timekeeper, and which is why we have UTC, Coordinated Universal Time, which is a result of keeping the Earth's rotation as part of our timekeeping system, which is where leap seconds come in. So I think everyone's heard of the leap second coming in. That's to keep that rotation of the Earth, which is gradually changing in line with atomic timekeeping, which is far more precise. So by adding leap seconds, you can keep the two aligned.
That's good. Just to make sure that it's not changing, to that the things are kept in check. I have just 2 final questions, but I think I'm gonna start because you mentioned about the redefinition of the second, and my next question is what's next for timekeeping, and that's where it seems that we might be going over the next decade or so.
Yes, the redefinition of the second is now coming, because now the newest atomic clocks are said to maintain accuracy to, oh goodness me, what was it, 1 second in 30 billion years, I believe. But yeah, so a new redefinition of the seconds. What that means for us in our daily lives, Possibly not very much. I was thinking about my parents. I'm not sure if they were alive and around the time when the second was redefined before, but I'm not even sure they noticed. So again, this will be big for some people, but less obvious maybe in daily life. But yeah, so the other thing that atomic clocks, which is building on these gravity, is these newest are. So I am out of my comfort zone here. I'm not a physicist. I wish I was, but it is a fascinating subject. I love reading about it. But I've been reading how, because current atomic clocks can measure the difference in time between your head and your feet. It's running slower at your feet than it is in your head. I was reading that these newest could measure the difference in time, so the effect of gravity on time in the breadth of a hair, which is just unbelievable.
I am a physicist, and yes, you're absolutely right. There are some fascinating application testing and general relativity in a way we have not been able to do before. But also, as you were mentioning, how we approach understanding the shape and the density of the Earth with pendulum, we can do that with these new clocks, but at a higher level of precision.
Yes. Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. And then also in space navigation, so there's kind of a parallel Harrison story going on where they're now developing portable, accurate atomic clocks to improve space navigation so that they can go further and farther and with more precision. And yeah, they have similar problems that they're facing in developing this that Harrison faced with his marine chronometer.
Thank you very much. I have just one final question, and it's a little bit more philosophical, possibly out of both of our comfort zone. But we have seen over the last several hundred years how precision timekeeping has developed, and it got more and more precise. What do you think does that tell us about the nature of time?
That's a very good one. So, yes, what is time, I guess? Are we going to be able to answer that question? I think that's probably the most fascinating one yet. I think all I understand about what is time is that the only place where it's applicable as our idea of time flowing in one direction, past to future, is that it's only applicable with entropy and the second law of thermodynamics. And I guess maybe in that area that we might make some groundbreaking discoveries that can mess with our minds even more.
It's, you see, physics always end up having to fight with thermodynamics. No matter how far we try to run, we always end up having to deal with the question of energy and entropy and ultimately what is time. Well, Emily, thank you so much for this absolutely fascinating conversation about the history of timekeeping and our little foray into astronomy, physics, and philosophy. So thanks to taking the time to speak to us.
Thanks very much for having me. Thank you.
The music in this episode is credited to Audioblocks and Pixabay.